And one other thing I wanted to announce, actually, I'm sorry, two more things. We have our brown bag lunches that have been, they're the first Wednesday of every month, starting at I'm sorry, at noon. And we've had our inaugural one earlier this month, and it went really well. They're just drop-in. You can come for the whole hour. You can come and go. It's just a way to speak with other pollinator activists and answer questions. And it's really for anybody. If you have a question on invasive species we were talking about last time, people have questions about how to plant for to try to get ground nesting insects, all sorts of questions. And we have people who are really knowledgeable there who can answer the questions. So I encourage everyone to come. It's a nice little break in the middle of the week, and you literally can bring your lunch and eat. It's okay. So I put the link to the registration in the chat. We hope everyone can join. That would be terrific. And then the last thing I'm going to announce is our next meeting of monthly meeting is Tuesday, March 26th at 7 p.m. It is going to be featuring people who worked on Cambridge's first Miyawaki forest on private property, which was very exciting. You may have seen it in the Boston Globe. There was a write-up about it. I hope you can come to that meeting. I'm putting the registration link for that in the chat. And now I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Academically trained as a wildlife biologist, Laura Kiesel is a naturalist, conservation advocate, and environmental journalist. Her articles and op-eds have appeared in Salon, The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The Washington Post, Earth Island Journal, Science, Inside Climate News, The Atlantic, and many other outlets. She is the founder of Save Arlington Wildlife, which seeds and mentors local grassroots movements looking to restrict rodenticides in their home communities, as well as the newly established nonprofit, the Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund, through the fiscal sponsor Mission Earth. Now I would like to introduce or welcome Laura to start her presentation. I will say, if you have questions, Laura had asked if they're really pertinent to understanding something she just said on a particular slide, go ahead and throw it in the chat and I will I'll interrupt her to answer the question. But if it's something more general or can wait till the end, that would definitely be preferred. But go ahead and put questions in the chat and I will keep track. And also at the end, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask yourself, but I also can ask for you if you would like. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you, Laura.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. So I hope everyone can see that. So let me see if I can turn off my camera part, but I don't think I can. Let me put it on the side. Well, thank you everyone for joining me tonight for this presentation. I've been giving these presentations for quite a few years now. I've been involved with this issue since 2015. I wanted to start off with a quote by Rachel Carson. I'm just getting rid of some of the banners on my page. The public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in full possession of the facts. So just to give a background of what we're going to be talking about tonight, we're going to be talking about rat poisons in general, but primarily I'm going to be talking about the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or SGARs, which include those four. And for people who don't know the background, there were the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, which you also see listed, but after, not very long, rodents started to build biological immunity to them, which means they didn't really work very well. And so then scientists developed the second generation, much more lethal, moved up the food chain much more aggressively. They work to inhibit vitamin K, which helps clot the blood, which means it basically thins the blood, and usually the animal dies of like an internal hemorrhage. There's also a lag time for these second generation, meaning a rodent can eat a fatal dose in one feeding in theory, but like it won't kill them till days or a week later, which means that they can do multiple feedings, and by the time a predator picks them up, they're now deadly to that predator. So my background is, my first degree is in journalism, but my second, then I went back to school for wildlife biology and environmental science, and I kind of combined those two loves of mine, and I do a lot of environmental journalism. So I did this article in 2018. It was my first feature article, and this looked a lot at local rodent management techniques. And I followed it up in 2021 when there started to be a series of high-profile wildlife deaths. And this one was syndicated in Salon and shortlisted for an investigative reporting reward. And it looks a little more deeply at like the role the EPA kind of plays in enabling these poisons, kind of the complicity of the pest control industry, and kind of muddying sort of the truth about how they work. In July of just last year, we got a top page editorial in the Boston Globe that also talked about the impacts of these poisons and supported efforts to restrict them in the state and in Arlington in particular.
Mark,
So
it's
just
cold.
a little bit of background, and just remind people to mute. In 2022, the town of Arlington, that's where I reside, became the first municipality in the Commonwealth to formally ban escars on our public lands. So that's all the lands that we own, our public properties. And that same year, we also became the first municipality to submit a home rule petition to the state of Massachusetts to ask to ban escars on private property, because right now there's a state law in effect, which there are in most states in the nation, that preempts municipalities from restricting or banning any kind of pesticide, including rat poisons, without special state permission. So we have to do a home rule petition if we want that. And then in 2023, in the summer, the city of Newton followed in our footsteps, and they also passed a public lands ban and submitted their own home rule petition. So I founded Save Arlington Wildlife, even though I had been doing this advocacy work since 2015 in the town and surrounding, and also appealing to the state. I decided at the end of 2021, early 2022, when we had a series of wildlife deaths in the town, to sort of more formally organize, and we started a website called savearlingtonwildlife.org. And from that, we sort of pushed, since we had already gotten our home rule petition, and our public lands ban, I started kind of trying to reach out to other people in other municipalities to try to see if they'd be interested in replicating some of the things that Arlington and Newton has done. And so I worked to seed and mentor people in other towns and cities who have a goal of restricting escars in their home communities. And I work very closely with them. So I work with them both to try to help them do this in their home communities, but since a lot of times that bill then goes to the state, we work collaboratively together to try to get that, as well as other relevant state bills pertinent to this issue, passed. And currently there are Save Wildlife chapters in Belmont, Lexington, Waltham, Newbury, and there's a brand new one in Somerville. So why Save Blank Wildlife? I chose that title, and we were going through some different options like Save Arlington Owls or Save Arlington Eagles, but since these rodenticides have pretty wide-ranging impacts to all wildlife, but also the idea of when you put in your municipality name, to really remind people that wildlife is everywhere. It's not just in remote or rural areas. So in my, when I was doing my wildlife biology coursework and I started doing fellowships, I went to places like Alaska to study wildlife. And yet I have to say, I've seen more wildlife here in the Boston metro area than I saw when I was in Alaska. I saw I have had closer encounters with bald eagles here in my own backyard. And I wanted to remind people that you don't have to be someplace like forested or a national park to have a rich biodiversity of wildlife. They're in your own backyards. And also to remind people that these wildlife are our neighbors. They exist in our community, and to foster feelings of familiarity with them. And also it just sort of resonates with that idea of think globally, but act locally. But of course, the issue is also that wildlife do not adhere to municipal borders. So even though we in Arlington did as much as we could do, you know, our eagles were still spending a lot of time in a lot of the neighboring municipalities, which is another reason why I wanted them to also implement their own home rule petitions and public lands bans. And it's also why I started recently a state organization called Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund. But I want to give you guys a little bit of the history about how this all came about. So as I mentioned, I've been doing advocacy for quite a while, but in 2021, we had our first confirmed bald eagle death due to escars poisoning. This was in Waltham. You can see the photo on the left. And then only a few weeks later, the photo on the right, as she's being removed, she was found dead on top of her unhatched egg. So that nest basically was wiped out by that. I'm sorry, this keeps doing a backwards thing. But that was not the first death that had been documented. It's just the first one that was confirmed by a necropsy by state officials. Like this was another eagle from 2018 in the Cape that was showing all the signs of anticoagulant poisoning. It just wasn't necropsied. And there's been several other cases I've heard of as well. And this is MK the Eagle. People might have heard about her. She died a year ago this week, actually. This was my first sighting of her in Arlington. And starting in March or April, she started nesting here with her mate. They were the first bald eagles to nest in Arlington in some 60 years since DDT had wiped them out. And they had their first chicks here. This is one of them. This is C25. They had 2 chicks. And then I watched them. I would go a few times a week and sort of keep tabs on them. And this is another photo of C25. And this photo is interesting because I watched MK that day bring a large rat to the nest. It was 4th of July, so I went to visit them. And I watched them tear apart the rat. And I don't know if you can tell, but in this area, you can see like these little green flecks. So they were eating a rat. And what happens is these poisons, they're dyed a bright green or blue, and it dyes the intestinal tracts of these rodents. And sometimes you can actually see the splatter when they're consuming these rodents. And unfortunately, only a few weeks later, C25 was found collapsed on the ground. So she was taken to Tufts Wildlife Clinic, and unfortunately, she passed only a couple of hours later. And so similar to the Waltham eagle, she was brought in for a necropsy, and it was confirmed that she died due to Escar's poisoning. So that was only 2 bald eagles in 5 months' time, which was pretty notable, and there was a lot of media coverage of it. But again, these are just the ones that were confirmed by necropsy. And then this past last year, MK was then found also on the ground. It was night, it was going on twilight. You know, they're diurnal predators. So if you're seeing them on the ground with no effort to try to get back up into their nest, that usually means something's wrong. So rescuers took her to New England Wildlife Center. She made it through the first night, but unfortunately the second night she succumbed to an internal hemorrhage. You can kind of see on the left, she bled out. And I'm sorry, I just could put a little bit of a trigger warning or content note. They're not super graphic photos, but we are going to be talking about some of the casualties of these, so people just might want to be aware of that. This is a problem across the nation. There was a huge study that was conducted actually the same year that MK first started nesting and C25 and the Waltham eagle died, that found that over 80% of American eagles, including bald and golden eagles, have been exposed to escars. And the reason I think that this is so profound is because it really kind of shows how we sometimes don't really learn from our mistakes, that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So bald eagles were completely wiped out by 1970. DDT was banned in 1972. It took 35 years for them to be removed from the endangered species list. Yet in Massachusetts, that recovery has been even slower. They were threatened. They were endangered until 2012 and threatened until 2020. And they were just demoted to species of special concern. And within a year, we started getting several of these bald eagle deaths. So they barely have a toehold in our state. And I feel like we're already getting some of the same impacts with a different kind of pesticide than we were seeing back in the 60s. And so when MK died, I'm not going to play this because we're on borrowed time, but I held a vigil and a rally, and over 300 people showed up, which was very surprising, but it also goes to show how much MK and just this issue resonates with so many people. As you can see, it sneaks around the corner. We marched from one of the town greens in Arlington to the town hall and addressed the audience and made some pretty strong demands that we wanted stronger restrictions on these poisons. See if it'll let me. And bald eagles, unfortunately, were not the only high-profile incidents of casualties that Arlington experienced. And this is probably another reason why so many people showed up to that rally. We also had a family of great horned owls that started nesting in one of our town parks in 2022. And you know, a lot of people felt sort of an attachment and affection for these owls. This is the mother owl on her incubating her eggs. And then here's one of the last photos that was taken of the owl and her 2 chicks. These chicks were just about to fledge and leave the nest, similar to C25. and then they disappeared for a couple of days. And unfortunately, the mother and one of her offspring were found on the ground. And a necropsy was not performed, but like the ACO did do a dissection, and it was like all the telltale signs of anticoagulant poisoning, like leaking watery blood that wasn't congealing even post-mortem. And as people may know, great horned owls often mate for life. They'll stay with each other year round. They'll preen each other. They'll help each other rear young. And so it was really sad over the course of the next 6 or 7 months to hear the widower male owl like hooting and not have a female like sing back with him. And so a lot of people were really celebratory when the following Thanksgiving he was spotted with a new mate in the park. But then only a couple weeks later, she also was found on the ground, spitting up watery blood. She died en route to the wildlife clinic. This time, I and a bunch of other citizens crowdfunded to have an independent necropsy performed to just be able to have data to show that she did succumb to eschar's poisoning, which the necropsy confirmed. And this was also a Cooper's hawk. Another bird of prey I watched in the neighborhood from nestling to fledgling, and then unfortunately one of them was found dead. And we also did an independent necropsy, and it showed that bromadiolone, which is an eschar that a lot of times pest companies tout as a low toxic eschar, killed it, and that is not true. There are no such thing as a low toxic eschar. And we've been just slammed lately with a lot of wildlife that have died in and around this area. One of the things Save Wildlife also does is we'll work with animal rescuers and wildlife rehabbers to collect these bodies and bring them in for necropsies, and we'll crowdfund so that we can get data sets to be able to show officials and the state that this is a real problem. But this has been happening for a while. Some people may remember in 2014, Ruby the red-tailed hawk of the Fresh Pond Mall fame, like she was found dead in the mall area, and they did a necropsy and it confirmed eschars. But this was before the poisons was as ubiquitous as they were today. Tufts Wildlife Clinic is one of the leading authorities in the country on this issue, and they did a first survey sample, I think it was 2006 to 2012, and they found an exposure rate in birds of prey of 86%, which in and of itself was just an astonishing number. But then they repeated the study from 2012 to, I think that says, my thing is covered from 2012 to 2017, I think, or 2016, and it jumped 10%, with the exposure rate now being 96%. And of a subset sample, all 100% of the 43 hawks they surveyed had eschar's exposure. But it's not just birds of prey. There are many other wildlife species that are very vulnerable to eschar's poisoning. Our foxes, our coyotes, a lot of the like smaller kind of what you might call mesopredators like skunks and raccoons and possums are all like very typical victims of these poisoning. In California, these poisonings have also been wiping out bobcat and even mountain lion populations to show how like toxic these are, that they can take out something as large as a mountain lion. And it's not just wildlife either. Pets are also very vulnerable. The MSPCA, when I interviewed them in 2018, and I think it's been pretty consistent when I followed up with them, they see dozens of cases every year of rodenticide poisoning, and mostly cats and dogs. And if those animals do survive, the cost of care can usually does exceed $2,000. I'm seeing more and more of these pet poisonings lately too. This was a friend of a friend, that is her rescue greyhound, and they stayed at an Airbnb a couple weeks before Christmas. It was listed as a dog-friendly Airbnb, and they had those bait stations. And what had happened is, due to the heavy rains, the bait actually flooded out and tainted the grass. And as many people know, dogs like to eat grass, so he had chewed on the grass, and unfortunately he died that night of anticoagulant poisoning, of a hemorrhage. And I've heard a lot of other very sad stories like this. This is a boxer puppy in Massachusetts that some people may have heard of, that died shortly after the new year, but that was not eschars, that was bromethalin, which is the neurotoxin that is still available over the counter, which is one reason why it's still important to really think about these other poisons, not just eschars. None of them are benign. But it's not even just animals. So Escar's poisoning has been a prominent problem for children, and it disproportionately impacts low-income Black and Brown children. They were finding that as many as, or even upwards of 10,000 children a year were getting poisoned when these poisons were available over the counter. And so there was the Natural Resources Defense Council, along with West Harlem Action, actually sued the EPA to try to get these off store shelves. And, you know, the conservative lobbying force said that that was an acceptable risk of level of child poisonings to be absorbed. Meanwhile, so they had this whole lengthy lawsuit battle back and forth for several years. And finally, in 2014, one of the manufacturers of these poisons, that was the holdout, agreed to take them off the shelves, but they wanted to keep having them available in these tamper-resistant bait stations that only licensed pest control professionals can apply. There's a lot of problems with that, though. And if some people are noticing, 10 years ago, you probably didn't see these bait stations like you do now, where they're like a pervasive staple of our metro areas. And I really think this might have been one of the reasons, is the manufacturers had all these product to push and they couldn't over the counter. And so they became more available either online or in these bait stations. So there is a loophole. The EPA is trying to probably close it with the new regulations they'll be releasing soon. But right now you can buy bulk quantities of these poisons on Amazon and other sites. But I really still feel like, from what I can see observing on every block, that the majority of these cases are from rodents that are eating these baits from these bait stations. So the question is, since these poisons were pulled from the shelves, but still allowed in these other ways, has it led to a decline in poisoned children? Now, there has been a decline, a fairly substantial one, though I'd still say not one. I think that we should try to eliminate poisonings of escars of children. There's been between a 46 and a 75% decline, but notably there's been a 60 to 80% increase in poisonings of children from the other rodenticides that are still available over the counter, such as the FGARs and bromethalin. The other problem is these bait stations are not tamper-proof. They are tamper-resistant, but I still see many examples of these broken open all around the metro area. This was a broken open bait station. As you can see, it's cracked in the corner, and it's not that apparent from the picture, but you could see just the beginning of the bait exposed. And this was right next to a Petco where they were doing a puppy training class outside within feet of this bait station, and the puppies were going near it. So I had the town officials remove it, but I've seen other examples of this. This is where a family of squirrels broke open the bait station and started distributing the bait around the yard. A few days later, they started dropping dead outside of out of the trees. So there's a lot of instances where these bait stations get broken open. But even if the tamper-resistant bait stations hold steady, the ultimate issue too is for wildlife that they do nothing to address secondary poisoning, because the idea is the rodent eats the bait and then they just go out in the environment. And as I mentioned, they can eat many, many times what a lethal dose is for rodents. So by the time something like a red-tailed hawk, this is one I actually watched in real time, stalking a rodent as it went into a bait station. And as you can see, it flew onto the ground. There's a bait station right in those hedges. A lot of times the rodents stalk these bait stations and they'll get a rat right after it comes out after feeding. Luckily, someone opened the door of this building and this red-tailed hawk flew away before it could catch this rodent. But I've seen this on multiple occasions. The Environmental Protection Agency is well aware of the impacts of these poisons. Every couple of years, they do a very thorough ecological risk assessment. They always conclude that these poisons have a very high level of risk for mammals and birds, and not just mortality, direct mortality, but even other kinds of things like growth and reproductive negative impacts. But EPA is coming to that conclusion, even though their data is woefully inadequate. So only 3 states in the entire nation actually do any kind of testing or reporting of wildlife. Massachusetts is one of them, but even us, we barely, other than some of the studies that Tufts has done or some of the MESA listed species like bald eagles, we don't test as protocol. The only 2 states that do it, I think, are California and New York. And so they're only going on data of 3 states. And just to show some of the disparities, like for instance, they do note that red-tailed hawks and great horned owls have pretty high rates, but they'll have like barred owls only. They said there's only been 4 deaths in 10 years and 3 screech owls that have died in 10 years. And I know just from interviewing many wildlife rehabbers in the Northeast that they've dealt with many poisoned screech and barred owls, a lot of whom have died. So the EPA also has a lot of gaps in their data. So why is the EPA still allowing these poisons, even though their data, what little data they have comparatively, is still showing that these poisons are so significantly hazardous to wildlife? Well, the EPA has a revolving door with the pest control industry. A lot of times they go from either from the pest control industry to the EPA, or that's where they go after they're finished with their appointments at the EPA. So there's a lot of conflict of interest here, and there's been a lot of these investigative reports. There's one in ProPublica. The Intercept has done a number of reports on this issue, including there was a bunch of EPA whistleblowers who said that they were being asked to rubber stamp chemicals and say they were safe, even though they were not properly assessing them, or like their findings, the conclusion allowing these chemicals weren't consistent with the data. So that, I do think there's a lot of politics that's happening here and corruption that's allowing these poisons to still be in the environment. Here's another example of the disparity is the New England Wildlife Center. They're the place that treated MK when she died. When I interviewed them, and this is just one wildlife rehab center in one state in the country, they get between 1 and 200 cases a year. The patients they're noting are taking much longer to recover and often needing more in-depth treatment than they used to, and those are for the ones that do recover. This owl that's pictured here, unfortunately, he died. You know, that entire great horned owl nest that he came from was nearly wiped out, and there was only one survivor, his sibling, and that owl needed to get vitamin K infusions every day for 9 months until his blood would clot on its own again and he would be released, and he could be released, which just shows how completely ubiquitous these poisons are now, that he needed 9 months of intensive treatment for his blood to clot again. And what's happening here is we're undermining one of our best defenses in keeping rodents in check. A single great horned owl can kill and eat over 4,000 mice a year and 15 to 1,600 rats. And even little screech owls, I don't have the slide here, but they also can eat over 1,000 mice and several hundred rats. And poison just can't compete with that kind of rodent control. But the National Pest Management Association, which is the main lobbying arm for the pest control industry, has done a lot to evade the messaging and make sure people think that you need poisons to control rodents. So they'll say, this is actually was on their mission statement. They got rid of it, but it says that one of their main missions was to counteract activist efforts on both the national and local levels by immediately, responding to any kind of action to try to restrict these rodenticides and other types of pesticides. This was a bald eagle that was found with Escar's poisoning in Connecticut. In Connecticut, they're currently considering a ban modeled after California, where these Escars are under a moratorium in most sectors. And the pest control industry mounted such like kind of like a David versus Goliath, like media of like, oh, it's going to be Ratmageddon, that the politicians sort of at the last minute last year kind of backed off temporarily of considering a moratorium, and instead they did some kind of like study committee. I think they're now revisiting it, but it just shows how fast they reacted. But the truth is there have been surveys and a lot of other things that show that unfortunately, like pest control professionals don't even really understand the products they're using. This was a survey conducted in 2017 of over 24 pest management professionals in Massachusetts. And sorry, it doesn't have the conclusion here. Did I switch it? Oh, here it is. So all of the respondents showed a very low level of awareness of the Escar's potency and half-life, and most of them used these poisons and virtually all of the respondents said that they were IPM or integrated pest management professionals, and yet almost all of them were using these poisons pretty regularly, and they didn't seem to be aware of the potency of these products and their toxic effects on wildlife. And the other problem is they're under no legal obligation to tell the truth to their customers. When I was interviewing the EPA, it took them weeks and weeks to answer this question, but they finally basically told me that it's not a violation under federal and currently here in Massachusetts state law for a pest control professional to make inaccurate claims about the impact of their products on pets or wildlife. So they can legally lie, is what that's saying. There's no repercussions for them. And I also interviewed a former pest control professional who was actually fired because he was trying to use more alternatives to poisons with his customers and sharing their impacts on wildlife. And he told me that the biggest commissions that most of these companies get are from these rodenticide subscriptions. So you may notice that a lot of times these bait stations, every 3 or 4 months, they're restocked. So it's under this sort of formula of like just keeping a perpetual rodent problem in effect. And then the NPMA has also spent hundreds of thousands of dollars lobbying state and federal elected representatives. The problem is that when these poisons do kill rodents, and there's many that they don't kill, a lot of times it causes the public health hazards that the pest control industry is saying these poisons will help address. So for instance, I don't know if other people have noticed, but 8 or 9, 10 years ago, I didn't really see a rat at all. And I definitely didn't see dead rats or dead and dying rats. And now I see it on a regular basis. I don't think a month goes by that I don't come across a dead or a dying rat. I've seen it in the middle of the day in broad daylight, right near schools, right on major avenues with heavy foot traffic, with little children and dogs walking right by them. And what that does is that increases chances of transmission of diseases and parasites and anything like that. So, a healthy rat's not going to have this kind of behavior. So this is another problem. And there have been some studies that show that having these poisons, this was one in 2021, they found that Norway rats that had anticoagulant rodenticides in their system were significantly more likely to have leptospirosis, as well as E. coli, than rats that don't have anticoagulant rodenticides in their systems. And that makes sense because these rodenticides lower your immune system and they're much more likely to make you get sick, both the wildlife that eat the rats, but the rats themselves. I think it's important to interrogate some of our fears and hatreds about rats. I'm not saying that they're not a public health threat, but I do think a lot of times the threats are overstated to get people to buy into these poisons. For instance, I get asked about the plague all the time, and there's usually only between 1 and 7 cases of the plague every year in all of the United States. It's not in New England. So that means you have literally between 1 in 30 million or 1 in 330 million chance of getting the plague from a rat. Whereas again, 10,000 children get poisoned. So the children are thousands of more times likely to get poisoned, statistically speaking, than to get sick from the plague. They do cause property damage. They can cause fires, and that's a legitimate concern. But again, I do think it's overstated. And there's just a lot of lore and folk tales and fiction going way back that has mythologized and stigmatized rats. They're not a rabies vector species. I get a lot of inquiries about rabies, and it's virtually unheard of for rats or mites to spread rabies. There are other diseases that they're vectors of, but that is not one of them. But in general, chances of diseases are pretty low between humans and rats. Again, if you have an active outbreak in your yard or your house, you want to address that. But I do think people worry if they see one rat 2 blocks away, that means they're going to get sick. And I think I said everything on this slide. And another interesting thing, again, regarding the plague, because it's brought up so often, is experts have more recently come to the consensus that rats didn't spread the plague of the Middle Ages that people often think about when they see them. But we are noticing a lot more rats in the past 10 years. As I said, I don't think I ever saw a rat in this area 10 years ago or even 6, 7 years ago. Now I see them pretty often. And there are a lot of different factors for that. Climate change is one of them. We're getting a lot warmer winters, so they're breeding year round. We're getting a lot more population density in the suburbs and a lot more development. And when there's more people, there's more trash. it's going to attract rats. And the development and construction, it doesn't increase their populations, but it does interrupt with their burrows. And so we're just going to see them more. It may not mean that they're always more than there were before, but we're going to notice them more because we're doing so much construction. The pandemic also, I think, increased a lot of observations of rats because the restaurant districts closed down for a while and more of them moved into some of the residential areas, but also more people were working from home and telecommuting, so they may have just noticed them more. But also, I think one of the reasons we're seeing so many rats everywhere is because we have poison everywhere. And I'm going to explain why. When you put out poison and you're leaving poison out perpetually 24/7, that is a food source that you are leaving for the rodents. And as I mentioned, similar to the first generation anticoagulants, they have now found that a lot of these rats and mice are building resistance to the second generation anticoagulants. By leaving these out, we're creating super resistant rats that a lot of these rats are not going to succumb to these poisons. Now, obviously, some of them still do because we see them dying, but a lot of them won't. And because they breed so prolifically, they'll probably get a pretty strong resistance in the coming years, whereas their predators, which are much lower breeders, right? They only have 2 or 3 chicks a year or a few cubs. They're going to die off, and that's going to be a mismatch. The other problem is bait shyness. These rats are extremely intelligent. They can usually make associations and see what's making them or their family members sick. One of the reasons escars were even developed to have a lag time between when they eat the poison and die is so that they wouldn't associate it, but they are still making those associations, some studies are indicating. But ultimately, the problem is we're killing off their natural predators. And those natural predators are some of the best rodent control we have. And what happens is when you kill off natural predators, you're going to artificially inflate their prey populations. This was something I studied a lot. I was actually studying to be a wolf biologist, so I've looked at predator-prey dynamics of what happens when you obliterate a predator or a prey base. And, you know, you get rid of the predator, the prey numbers explode. And I had a slide. I thought I had a slide here. Oh, no, I think I went through it already about how many mice and rats that the owls eat. So what are some of the best ways to get rid of rodents? Well, I mean, it really is about sanitation and waste management and exclusion. One thing I tell people, and I know it's not always a popular suggestion because I'm an avid birder, I love birds, and I'm sure a lot of people in this audience do too, is to consider getting rid of your bird feeders, especially during the warmer weather. There have been a lot of studies that show that a house with a bird feeder is something like more than triple to quadruple more likely to have a rat nest within 7 to 8 feet of it. And even if you're saying, well, even if I get rodents, I'm not going to use poison, I can't tell you how many people have written me and said, hey, I don't want to use poison, but my neighbor has a bird feeder they refuse to take down. The rodents are coming into my yard, so I'm using poison. So even if you're not going to use poison, if the bird feeders attract them, your neighbors probably might, and you can't control what your neighbors are doing. So one way is to really control what you're doing in your yard. If you do get bird feeders, take them out overnight. Don't leave them out between dusk and dawn. And again, warmer weather especially, and consider rodent-proof bird feeders. And other things like keeping your composting indoors, rinsing out your cycling, picking up pet waste, looking on exclusion in your home. What are the porous areas, the entry points that rodents could be coming in or getting out is really important. And here's another really low-hanging fruit thing, is really try not to take your trash to outdoor barrels or dumpsters until at least the night before, preferably the morning of pickup. Again, it sounds really simple, but they've done a lot of studies that show that this really can help go a long way to reducing rodents. And if people, I have had some people say, well, that's really hard to do, I have a large family. There are some things that could be done, maybe get a trash compactor, but it's something to explore. So just wrapping up, some things you can do on a larger level where it's not just what do I do in my own life to kind of reduce rodents without poisons. If you're like, I want to make change in my home community where I'm seeing these bait stations on every block, is really consider joining or starting your own local Save Wildlife initiative. I will work with you to help you, consult with you on any issues or challenges you're facing. But I think that we already have, at this point, over a half a dozen Save Wildlife chapters. And so it's gaining a lot of momentum. So there are a lot of people you can talk to and ally with. here's some things that we've done in Arlington. And I know some of the other Save Wildlife chapters are doing. We started a poison-free pledge campaign where we went to some local businesses if they didn't have these bait boxes or weren't using poisons. And, you know, we'd give them some free kudos and press if they weren't using poisons, and we'd give promote them on our social media, and they get a little boost in business to help incentivize this practice. As I already mentioned, the big thing was we would work to restrict the public lands bans in your community, and also get home rule petitions to ask to ban on private property. Some other things we asked, like in Arlington, because there's so much development, I found out that like a lot of the construction permits, they were just using bait stations during the demolition phase of construction. And so I worked with the Board of Health, and they did a new type of, it was called like a rodent management permit application process or something, where they asked them to use non-poison options instead. And there's an exemption only if there's like a huge outbreak and other things fail, that they can use poisons. And so they said that hasn't happened yet. So they just don't use poisons at these pre-demolition sites. And you can also urge your local housing authority to ban these anticoagulant rodenticides. Pretty much every municipality just about has a housing authority. This is the public housing complexes. They have a locally elected board, so they're usually beholden to their constituents and what they think about things. So I just think it's there's a lot of options for exerting some gentle pressure and getting places to start giving up poisons before you even get to the full legislative route in your town or city. In addition to the home rule petitions and the other things I spoke about, Save Wildlife, we Save Arlington Wildlife, and I know a lot of the other Save Wildlife chapters, we support the idea of returning local control of pesticides to the municipalities. The reason we're sort of in this mess is because what happened is in the 1980s, the pest control industry went around to all these states and said, hey, you don't want to give towns and cities the right to regulate pesticides. You want to have that. And they did that on purpose because it's harder to kind of get towns and city. It's easier to, as constituents, to appeal to our town and city officials than state officials. And I think they realized it would be harder to get things restricted as environmental hazards arose. And it's not just rodenticides, right? And since we're in the pollinator, a pollinator group, there's pesticides that are harming our bees and butterflies too that could probably be restricted, but unfortunately a lot of municipalities don't have that ability. So there's only 43 states have laws on the books where we are not allowed as a town or a city to ban escars or any other pesticides. So yes, we're pushing for home rule petitions, but what's going to happen is in a few years, we're going to say, hey, we also maybe have to look into the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, or bromethalin, which is a neurotoxin, which is also causing a lot more harm to wildlife than originally thought. It also killed a bald eagle around the time of MK. So we would like to work on this bill, H814. It'll probably become a different bill number in a few months, to try to get local control returned to the municipalities. And this is from the National Pest Management Association. This is one of their statements, is how they strongly believe that the EPA and only the states should be able to regulate pesticides. But obviously I feel very differently. And we had a whole rally back in May where wildlife conservation advocates pushed, and we got some media about how towns and cities should have some rights to regulate, because it's our wildlife that are being harmed in our borders. So we are bearing the burden of this problem. And I've seen local control and action in other ways. I was involved in my town's plastic bag ban, polystyrene containers. Many of you might live in communities that have banned those gas-powered leaf blowers. It doesn't make sense to me that we're allowed to put restrictions on some of these other environmental hazards, but not something like pesticides. Another thing that people can do is there's this great citizen project that is ongoing called the EWA, or Earthwise Aware Escars Brigade. It's really easy. You can download the app on your phone or go on the computer. If you see bait stations around your neighborhood, you can take pictures, find, if they're clearly labeled, You know, assuming it's not on private property where you can't go on. You can get pictures of the label to see what it is, and also see if you see dead wildlife, observe them. So, because if we have more rigorous data, we're going to do a better job of convincing state officials to help us better restrict these. So just wrapping up, I'm here to answer questions. Save Arlington Wildlife. We kind of work, or mostly it's me, on a shoestring budget. So if there's anything, if you want to help support the cause, we have a Patreon. That's my PayPal, and there's also a bonfire that, like, we sell t-shirts on bonfire saying wildlife rat poison is wildlife poison, that you can buy, and a portion of the proceeds go to Save Arlington Wildlife. But also, as I mentioned, I did just start a nonprofit, the Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund. It's going to be a little different. We're going to offer some supports to like local chapters, but we're going to be looking more for that statewide initiative on getting more commercial ad campaigns out just to educate people around the state on poisons. And one of the things we're looking into is trying to get an MBTA campaign, like an ad on the MBTA system or at some MBTA stops, so that people can start thinking about this in their daily life. And if you're interested in that, that's the QR code for Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund. But also, if you just go to the savearlingtonwildlife.org website, the top post is about Save Massachusetts Wildlife Education Fund, and you can click on the donate button, because we're trying to do a big fundraiser over the next several weeks to get to that MBTA fundraising goal, and hopefully get that in later this spring. And that's basically it. I just want to wrap up I started with a Rachel Carson quote, and I wanted to end it. How could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is precisely what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them.
Laura, thank you so much for this really compelling argument about why we need to stop using these poisons. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I will start by reading the questions in the chat. I welcome anyone to raise their hand. Probably using the raise hand function. If you look along the bottom of your screen, there will be a reactions button with a little smiley face. If you click on that, if you open it up, it should have raise hand in there, and that way you'll bump to the top, so we'll be able to see you. The first question I see is, can we regulate at the local level? Do you have a sample regulation we can employ? I think that, and then they're wondering about, maybe show the Board of Health in Hardwick. Or actually, I'm sorry, maybe Judith, I don't know if you want to answer this question. Maybe, are you from the Board of Health in Hardwick? And you're looking for a sample regulation that you could use? If you want to explain, go ahead. Or otherwise, Laura, just if you want to talk about a sample regulation, that would be great.
Yes, so both Arlington and Newton have now passed public lands bans, so people can refer to those. Cities and towns tend to go about things a little differently. So if you're from a city versus a town, I think Hardwick is a town, so you may want to look at what Arlington did. Sometimes towns have differentiations. Like here in Arlington, we have a really strong Town Manager Act, so we couldn't by town meeting directly ban eschars. But what we did is we passed a non-binding solution strongly requesting that the town manager adopt an integrated pest management plan that prohibited eschars on its public properties. And so that's a mouthful, but that's how we went about it. I mean, I know some other municipalities have done some things a little differently, like the town of Newbury just a few weeks ago. They banned, their select board voted to ban eschars on its public properties effective immediately. Didn't even have to go to town meeting. I think the person from there is here tonight and could clarify. And so the public lands ban went in effect right away, and it didn't have to go through town meeting. But as I mentioned, you cannot ban on private property because of the state preemption laws that I was showing the map about, and Massachusetts is one of them. So you do have to submit a home rule petition. So that would have to go through either your town meeting if you're a town, or your city council if you live in a city. And it's a little different, the process, but it's still, you know, I think with a city council, you have to get an actual city councilor to agree or be a champion of this. Whereas, you know, a town meeting, I think any citizen can do a citizen petition, though it helps to have a co-sponsor or someone in town meeting to support you. Either be a sponsor or agree to help like introduce your law and work with you on it. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Let's see. The next question. Can poisons be safely disposed of? Is it even possible?
So this is an interesting question, and I have to admit it, until like 6 or 7 months ago, I wasn't sure of this either. When I looked it up, because this is hazardous waste, I think the recommendation is you need to take it to a hazardous waste collection day, because I think it needs a special incinerator, which I think tells you how hazardous this is, because I do know sometimes people say, oh, just throw the bait station out. And you know, I always say don't do that, please, because if it's not going to an incinerator, if it's going to a landfill, it's just going to still do what it does. Like rodents are going to eat it, wildlife that hang out in the landfill will still eat them and die. And it could also be harmful to the sanitation workers. But that's what I've heard, is you have to try to take it back to hazardous waste collection, and it goes through a special incinerator.
Okay, we have a question. How effective are electric rat zapper traps? Do you know? If you
Like the
don't,
smart boxes.
Brucey, do you want to clarify that?
Either smart box, or the Victor model that's about $40. It's
Yeah, I know that I think Arlington's doing a smart box project, and that's like a high capacity electric box. I think they've had pretty good, I don't know about Somerville, Arlington's numbers, but I know Somerville's doing a smart box pilot, and I think they've had pretty good numbers. I think there've been something like 60% reduction rate at some of the test pilot sites. So those look pretty promising. I have to admit, I don't really know for the $40 ones that you can buy on Amazon and put in your home. I've seen some good reviews, but I don't know if I haven't seen a study specifically that mentions, like, statistically speaking, how much like the reduction rate is.
Okay, here's one that's going to be near and dear to the heart of people listening. Rats showed up in my pollinator wildlife supporting yard a few weeks ago and seem to have created extensive burrows. Oh, this is terrible news. I'd already stopped using my bird feeder, though neighbors behind me refused to take down theirs. I already carry out the other suggestions. What should I do? Can the town help implement a dry ice treatment?
I don't know what your specific town does, but I was going to say dry ice is something you can look into. I know some towns and cities do offer some supportive services for rodent control. I mean, I think Somerville does, and I think they're considering dry ice as extending it and implementing that. But I don't know if your municipality does specifically. You'd have to ask. But if not, I would look into someone to help you distribute do targeted dry ice and confirmed rat burrows. Yeah, that is what I've been told by my Board of Health. And again, I'm not sure how it might differ from city or town, is that if there's a bird feeder that is being very problematic, that the Board of Health can compel a person to take their bird feeder down, either at least for a certain amount of, I know that I think the norm is 2 to 3 weeks to start, but if it's been a repeatedly problematic feeder, I think they can compel you or fine you if there's been repeated issues with rodents, is what I was told by my Board of Health. So you might want to check and see. And that's something, if that isn't a policy, that I would actually like to see more, because sometimes I have heard other people say that what happened was the Board of Health went there and said to the person with the bird feeder, you have to do something about the rodents, and then they put down poison, which really is not going to help, because the bird feeder is still there, the attractant, and now the poison's still there, which is another attractant. So I would check and see what your Board of Health is willing or able to do by their policy. And if they're not doing the thing that I think is the better option, which is compelling people to take them down if they're problematic, and do mitigation options, then I'd work on them through an effort to try to make them implement that kind of policy.
I know just from personal experience in my neighborhood, I'm in Somerville, that there are I know plenty of places that are completely bare in the front yard and have no growth and are riddled with rat tunnels.
Yeah.
So I always, I know it's always, you know, people get warned, and, you know, I've gotten notices, tickets actually in my front yard, which is a pollinator, it's not overgrown, but they say it's overgrown. Anyway, pollinator habitat, and, you know, and the
Mhm.
towns often want to try to scare you away from that. But I would say hopefully that your yard is actually attracting the birds of prey that we want. So, um, okay, I believe that was all of our questions, and we are coming up on time. So, Laura, thank you so much. This was really terrific.
Oh, can I just make one last request? If by any chance people who aren't on my mailing list want to be on it, Renee said it was okay that you could put your email in the chat at the end before you log off, and can give me the emails and I will add it, because I am going to be putting out a big mailer next week, both about the MBTA fundraising campaign, but also regarding Arlington and Newton's home rule petitions, because Arlington still has not been voted out of the environmental committee. So we're trying to do a big push to get that voted out of committee. And then when it comes up for a vote in April, and there's a few other action items that people might be interested in.
Great. Yes. So you're getting tons of emails. I'll share the chat with everybody. I'll send it out a link to the recording and the chat for everybody. This was really great. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you all for coming. And I hope to see you next month to learn about the first Miyawaki forest on private property. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.